So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our seminar today. Our speaker is Dhruv Balwada, and Dhruv is a student of Kevin Spear, who was the original seminar invitee, and at the last minute Kevin had to back out, so he kindly sent his student, which is good for him and good for us. And so a few of us have spent a very nice day with Dhruv so far, and he'll give you his seminar. It's primarily going to be aimed at the Southern Ocean, and we have a few people in here that are actively working in the Southern Ocean. And there'll also be a little bit of an introduction to a program going on in the Northeast Gulf of Mexico, also using these floats, which is not Dhruv's activity, but he'll at least show a slide or two or something like that. And so I'll sit down and shut up, and I'll let Dhruv. You're going to shut up? Is that a promise? I promise. Not as bad. 1 out of 2 ain't bad.
Well, thanks, Bob. So, as you already said, I'm a student with Kevin Spear, and sadly I have to fill in for him. So this is the work that we have been doing as a group, and it's most of the work that's going to be part of my PhD thesis, and it's part of this big experiment that's called DIMES. So before I go into what DIMES is, it stands for diapicnal and isopicnal mixing experiment in the Southern Ocean, which means the vertical and the horizontal mixing in the ocean. And it was an experiment that was a collaboration between the United States and the UK. And you can see all the universities that are involved. And so this is a schematic showing what the ACC looks like. So on the left, you see the coast of Antarctica. There's topography that's represented. And the arrows show the general directions in which water masses move. And so the way that the system works is that you have strong winds that blow from the west on the surface. They impart momentum to the ocean. And because the Southern Ocean is the only place where you do not have any zonal boundaries, that you can go from west to east all the way around the globe without experiencing any land, the water starts to move. It goes around Antarctica. And one of the things that we are interested in is a water mass that's called upper circumpolar deep water. These are the layers, the density layers of the ocean, which are higher than the sill depth, which is the highest depth at which topography blocks the flow. This is the place where zonal pressure gradients cannot set up, so you cannot have a mean flow that's north-south. And so you need some eddy component to be able to flux mass or heat or anything towards the south. And that's where the experiment was designed to be in. And because we wanted to know the eddy properties. So going ahead, the DIMES had different components. There was the big component where we released floats. These are neutrally buoyant instruments that go and sit at a certain density level. And in this case, I'll show you, but it's approximately 1,000 meters. And they flow around with the current, and then they come back to the surface and send us the data. There was a tracer component in which a chemical tracer that can be easily detected was released. And we went back every 6 months or so to get transects across the ACC to see how much the tracer had spread. One thing that I want to mention right now is that because we are interested in how things move across the ACC, we are interested in the meridional diffusivity. And that's the region in which DIMES was operating. There was a mooring component in which moorings were deployed in the Drake Passage downstream of some topography so that we could study dynamics of eddies and vertical motions. There was also a microstructure and fine structure component in which we are trying to study turbulence at centimeter level scales. That's the microstructure, and fine structure, which is looking at internal waves, which have the scale of a few meters to a few hundred meters. So going ahead, so a little overview of what the float experiment and how the field work operated. This is a map of the region. The black lines are the subantarctic front and the polar front, which are two important fronts in the ACC. The blue dots that you see over here are the places where the sound sources were deployed. So you need to have a sound source which basically insonifies the ocean, and you use it to track the floats once they're. You can't use a GPS. You can't use GPS anymore to know where they are. The gray lines are the initial launch locations of most of the floats. The yellow star is where the tracer was deployed. And so if you can see that the primary interest was to study what's happening between the subantarctic front and the polar front, and so everything was deployed around it or within it. There's the timeline of the experiment. The experiment was started in 2009, which was when we went out and put in our sound sources, which are fixed. We started deploying floats. We launched the tracer, which was launched in a 27.9 isopicnal, and the experiment has been going on, and there's 2 more cruises left. One is in 3 weeks, and then there's another one early next year. And for people who don't know what a Rayforce, or the float that we study is called a Rayforce float, that's what it looks like. It's a tube about that high. It's made out of glass so that it can withstand a lot high pressures that it faces. So this is just a little movie that I made of what the data look like. So in this, what you're seeing is, before I started, you're standing towards the north, and the high region over there is Antarctica. Each red sphere on there is the location of a float, and there's a tail that the float has, which is its position for the last 21 days. So a long tail means that the floats are moving fast. And right now they have been deployed in the Southeast Pacific in 2009. The Southeast Pacific is primarily flat. There's a few seamounts here and there, but there's not a lot of roughness at the bottom. 2010, another deployment is done, and the camera is just moving around to show you that there's some vertical spread in where the floats were. That's South America. It's Chile right there. And then at some point they start to enter the Scotia Sea, which is right over here, and that's your Drake Passage. And something that I want you to remember from this movie is that if you look at the Southeast Pacific, it's very smooth. You look at the Scotia Sea, there's a lot of topography, there's a lot of roughness. And this is really important for the way that the current system works in this region. Another thing to note is that this is a choke point for the ACC. This is where the streamlines come together and the velocities increase. Going ahead. Okay, so this is all the tracks that we got from the floats. There were 210 floats that were deployed. We got back tracks from 140. There were failures. And so in this, I've divided the floats based on the floats that stayed shallow, so less than 1,000 meters depth, the floats that stayed deep, greater than 1,000 meters. The yellow dots are where they were deployed, so you can see that most of them were deployed at 105 west. The red dots are where they surfaced. And one of the things that you see is that the shallow floats, obviously, they're higher up in the current. The current velocities decrease with depth generally, and so the shallower floats went farther east. The deeper ones, not so much, and I'll go into more details of what the tracks showed us. So this is just an overview of what the data set looks like. If you look at, so the floats are not recording salinity. The only measurements that we have are temperature, pressure, and their position. And so if you look at the histogram of temperature, you see that there's a single peak at about 2.3 degrees Celsius, which corresponds to the 27.9 isopicnal. In depth, you see there are 2 peaks, and this is for what was the time coverage for the floats. The first set was deployed in 2009, which was 50 floats, another 150 in 2010, and they were supposed to be there for 2 years, and so you see a trailing edge towards 2012. This is what they look like in space. Obviously, there's the highest density just downstream of where they were deployed. The ACC the ACC is moving from the west to the east. So now for initial conditions, where did the floats actually equilibrate once they were put into the current? And so these are hydrographic sections that were collected at the time of deployment. The first column over here shows oxygen. The second one shows salinity, and the third one shows temperature. And and the dashed lines are the locations of the density or isopycnals. And the lower one is 27.9, it's denser. And the higher one is 27.6. And so the first year deployment was a deep deployment, and you see that a lot of them did equilibrate approximately where the isopycnal is. And you can see that in all of them. The second year, there were the shallow deployment and the deep deployment. There's more spread in the second year. We don't know exactly why this happened, but there still seems to be these two levels at which they're trying to stay. One of the reasons why the floats were deployed at two different levels was to understand how the stirring or the mixing processes in the ACC differ in the vertical direction. We have reason to believe that as you go deeper, the deeper layers are actually more efficient at mixing tracers or properties around. And so we wanted to test that. And again, as I said, we tried to deploy them in between polar front and the subantarctic front, and you can see that in the hydrographic properties from looking at temperatures and salinity. Not going to go into details of that. Another thing, as I said, we wanted to look at upper circumpolar deep waters, and one of the water mass signatures of UCDW is that it is an oxygen minima. And you see that the lighter colors represent lower values, and so there's your UCDW or sitting in the ACC. Going ahead. So now we wanted to see how well they did at maintaining their isopycnal nature. So we don't have salinity, so it's hard to predict what density they're lying at. So we looked at a state estimate or a model which has data assimilated in it. And we want to see if there's a one-to-one correlation between your neutral densities and temperatures. And so these are all the profiles in this region from a model called SAUCY, and of neutral density versus temperature. And you see that there's this curve, and it's actually doing a pretty good job. So if you are looking at temperature, you get an indication of what density level they're at. And so about 2.2 degrees corresponds to about 27.9, a little lower than that. And this is what the floats did. So these are distribution functions for each individual float, plotted with a float number on the x-axis and the temperature that the float had, the fraction of days that the float stayed at a certain temperature on the y-axis. I've sorted this out in ascending order of mean temperature. That's why you see this pattern over here. And this is where 27.9 is. And you see that the floats which were deployed deeper did do a pretty decent job at staying at the density level that they wanted to. The shallower ones showed more sinking. Then there's the set that just sort of sank. Didn't do as well as we expected it to. Okay, so now getting away from what the data looks like and getting more into what they actually tell us about the current. So one thing that you're absolutely sure about is the displacement of the float. You know where you put it in, you know where its surface is, because it does a satellite fix once it comes out. And so these are displacements of floats that were there, that were underwater for 2 years. All the shorter trajectories have been removed. The red lines show floats that are shallower. The blue lines show floats that are deeper. Generally, you see what you would expect, that they go east, and then once the ACC goes through the Drake Passage, it takes a northward turn and starts to move up along the coast. And the shallower floats go further ahead. Another thing, so then you can look at the zonal displacement to see actually how far they went. So this is a scatter plot of zonal displacement versus the mode temperature of a float. And so it gives you sort of an indication of how quickly that layer is moving in the zonal direction. And you see that there's a lot of floats that if nothing changes all the way around Antarctica, and they keep moving in the same fashion that they're moving in this region, it would take them more than 12 years, just for fun, to know how long it takes to take a circle around Antarctica. For reference, if you were at the surface drifters take about 3 years to go all the way around. That's a plot of how they change their sea surface height, which is a coordinate that we use to get an indication of how they're going towards the south. Because if you were to only look at their latitudinal positions, you don't know if they're actually going south or not, because the ACC itself takes a southward turn and then goes back north. The signal in delta SSH is more noisy, but generally speaking, you see that there's a southward drift, which is what you would expect for upper circumpolar deep waters. Although I wouldn't go ahead and say that this is a signal of the eddies fluxing material to the south. There's other possibilities. It can be a sampling bias because you have variation in eddy kinetic energy, or just the way that the floats were initially released, that they experienced eddies that were going south. So we are still working on trying to figure out if we can extract the signal out of this. So going ahead now, we're going to talk about the basic velocity statistics for the region. So looking at the mean velocities and the variance. And we know that the Southeast Pacific and the Scotia Sea behave differently. There's different topography. There's other reasons that they behave differently. And so we bend the floats in both the regions and look at what happens. And so you see the Southeast Pacific, and the circles represent the zonal velocities and the stars represent the meridional velocities. And you see that there's this general decrease in mean energy with depth, which is, again, a sign of what the ACC does. Something that's, and there is no net mean flow to the south, and the ACC is primarily zonal in the Southeast Pacific, and so you see a very low meridional velocity. The Scotia Sea, the ACC is taking a northward turn. You see positive meridional velocities. Again, it's decreasing with depth. Something to note is that the mean velocity increases by a factor of about 2 in the Scotia Sea. Things are moving faster. Now, if you look at the variance, you see similar sort of things. You see that the eddy kinetic energies, or the variance of flow, is decreasing with depth. Although you do see in the Southeast Pacific that there's sort of these two different scales at which they decrease. It decreases quickly up to 1,000 meters, and then it sort of starts to flatten out more. In the Scotia Sea, again, you see a decrease with depth. Again, the Scotia Sea has a much higher eddy kinetic energy, and this is something that's even noted in sea surface height, the data of sea surface height. It's higher by a factor of about 2.5. Okay, so great. We looked at the binned averages. Now, what does the thing look like in 2 dimensions? So we just make bins, and horizontal bins. So a bin that's a square rectangular area, and we look at what the mean velocities and the velocity variance looks like in that region. So this is the Southeast Pacific. That's the Scotia Sea. They're plotted separately because the color scale changes once you go to the Scotia Sea. Everything's moving much faster. In the Southeast Pacific, you do see an indication of as if there are these 2 strong current regions, and we believe that these are some sort of indication of where the subantarctic front and the polar front are lying. Scotia Sea, things start to change a little bit. You do have 2 jets, but rather than just being somewhere in the stream, they're more strongly constrained by the topography. The gray colors, which you can kind of see in the back, are the positions of strong topography or strong variations in topography. And you have a jet that's associated with that, which is the continental shelf, where the continental shelf ends. And there's a ridge over here, which is called the West Scotia Ridge, and there's a strong current associated with that. If you look at the eddy kinetic energy, it's hard to get a sense of exactly what's happening in the Southeast Pacific, but generally speaking, the higher eddy kinetic energies are located between the fronts. And the little ellipses that you see on there are standard deviation ellipses, so it gives you an indication of which is the dominant direction of variability, and they're mostly circular. There's some zonal structure at this one point. If you look at the Scotia Sea, one of the things that really jumps out is that that's the Shackleton fracture zone. It is the place where the Drake Passage starts. That's where topography starts to get rough. And as soon as you cross the Shackleton fracture zone, your eddy kinetic energy jumps up by a factor of about 3. Another thing that you see is that the regions where you have higher eddy kinetic energies are generally regions of lower mean flows. I guess that's all that I have to say about that slide. Again, remember the color scales are different between both of them. So, okay, we looked at the averages. We sort of have an idea of what the flow is doing at certain depth or how it's varying with the vertical in this region. And so then we come back to the original question that we wanted to ask. Well, how are these eddies mixing things around in this region? And so that's just a stock picture from Google. So that's mixing. You put cream in coffee, it mixes, and you see these filaments that are everywhere, and it's a very complicated process in a coffee cup and in the ocean, if anything more complicated in the ocean. So these are just some fun pictures. There's a picture of what I call float triangles. So the way that the experiment worked was that we wanted to see how things spread away from each other, even at the smallest scales. So the floats were deployed in pairs or triplets. And so this is an image which shows a single triplet and how it behaved for, if I remember right, 500 days. So you connect all the floats together, and you see that there's a tiny, tiny dot over there because they're all in the same place. And they stay together for a little while, and so the color represents time. And over time, they start to spread, and at some point, yeah, the ocean is chaotic. It's going to move things apart that even start with the same initial conditions, and you just get an idea of what's happening. I'll come back to that later. So the general thing is that floats separate over time. Okay, great. We already knew that. Some of the questions that we want to ask is that, is mixing diffusive, which means that is it okay to parameterize these eddy fluxes by some sort of diffusivity multiplied by a large mean gradient? I'll come back to that in further slides. Another thing that we really wanted to know was that, how does the stirring vary how does it vary with depth? Does the mean flow have some effects on it? Is the eddy kinetic energy the only thing that might be affecting it? So if we know the eddy kinetic energy, great. Do we know what's happening? I don't know. Are topographic effects important? Or is it the presence of non-zonal flows? The ACC is taking a northward turn, and we know that on a planet, zonal flows act very differently than meridional flows in dispersing things. And so this is a picture of, again, delta sea surface height, which was a coordinate system that we used to know how far south they go, and just their position over time. So all the floats are plotted over there, and the basic point over here is that, okay, on an average, they're going south, as the scatter plot showed us initially, that the black line represents the mean. They're also spreading, and so is it okay to fit just this envelope that's growing with time to these floats? Well, we'll find out. Okay. So before I go into looking at if the mixing was actually diffusive or something else, this is something that we did to get a more kinematic sort of picture of what is happening. So something that people do in 2D turbulence, and if they're trying to understand how particles are behaving in that, is that they look at different regions of the flow. They identify it as elliptic or hyperbolic regions. Hyperbolic regions are where things are separating really quickly from each other. They are generally present on the flanks of eddies. There's the other kind, which are elliptic regions, which are trying to constrain things to stay within a certain region and not let them go out. And so this would usually be in the middle of the eddy where the flow is strong enough that material just stays in it. And so we use a very crude sort of representation of it, and we just look at the displacement, the ratio of displacement to distance. And so if the displacement and distance are the same, it means that the float did not stick anywhere, or did not wiggle too much. It sort of just went in straight lines. If it was in an eddy and was looping around a lot, you would see that the track length would be much longer than the actual displacement that the particle experienced during its track. And so, okay, we can find the ratio. Once we find the ratio, we know that lower values indicate more trapping events during the time that the float was there. One thing that we did was cut out the tracks into 4-month segments, because over the 2-year life of a float, it's definitely going to see more than one kind of region. It'll see hyperbolic and elliptic regions. Maybe in 4 months, we'll be able to separate it out pretty good. And so something that we see over here is that, okay, yeah, sure, they're both elliptic and hyperbolic trajectories, crudely saying. But there's some sort of spatial localization of where these things are happening, at least for the time frame that the floats were sampling it. And we believe that some of these regions might actually be, some of these features where elliptic events happen might actually be persistent in time. You have this region over here, which you can see in topography over here, is sort of like a circular basin. And it's called the Yaghan Basin. And that is a region. So in the ocean, the flow tries to flow along depth contours. And so over here, the flow comes in and then tries to go around it, and there's this recirculation that sets up in the middle. And this recirculation is obviously not entirely steady. Sometimes it breaks up. And so you have this recirculation zone where fluid might be trapped, or is this a region where things get stirred around as soon as they enter the Scotia Sea? There's a seamount present over here. You can kind of see it over here. It's about 150 kilometers in meridional extent, so it's big enough to affect the flow. And you see that just downstream of that, there's a very strong region where floats get trapped in eddies. And and if you go back to this, you see there's your seamount, and there's sort of the mean flow decreases behind that. And what we think is happening is that in the other regions, you have strong mean flow, and eddy is trying to capture your particles within itself, but the mean flow comes along and just pulls the particles away from it. But once your mean flow gets suppressed due to some topographic features, the eddies are more capable of holding things within themselves. So, okay, this is great. It gives us a picture of what's physically happening, but now we want to quantify things a little bit more. And so now we try to look at some statistical sort of picture of what's the thing that's happening. So in 1921, Taylor came up with a measure of dispersion and diffusivity. And so the way that he defined diffusivity was that you look at the dispersion of a particle from its initial position. So if you were to look at, let's say, a patch of dye that you release somewhere, it's slowly going to spread. And the rate at which your cloud spreads in time gives you an indication of how good the flow processes are at mixing whatever they're trying to mix. And so dispersion and the rate of dispersion gives you a number that's called diffusivity. And that's the formula. And then you can do different things with it. There's a time derivative right there. You can take it into your average, which is the average over all the particles that are there, because you're looking at some statistical quantity. You can replace distances by integrals of velocities. You can take the integral out and come up with all these different formulas for your diffusivity. And the thing is that when you do it in this way, the problem is that it's real world data. It has noise in it. And when you start taking time derivatives of data, the noise gets amplified. And so over here, the red line is this quantity ddt, or gradient. And so you see that it's all over the place. It goes all the way from minus 500 to about 2,000. And we want to calculate a number. And this is the entire range of the sort of diffusivities that you see in the ocean anywhere. So, okay, this doesn't work. That's not saying anything. We look at forms that are integrals, so an integral of velocity autocorrelation, and we see that, okay, that's much smoother. It seems to asymptote off to a value. And the reason why we want to look at long-term behavior is because we're not interested in what's happening at the smallest scales right now. We want to see that you have all these eddies that are moving these floats around, and once the floats are farther away than an eddy length scale, they will be spreading similar to what Brownian motion does. So just random velocity fluctuations here and there are moving your particles away from each other. And so yes, we are interested in the long time limit. There's two other lines on here, the black line and the circles, and I'll explain what that is. So by the way, what I'm going to present from now on has been submitted to JPO for publication. The reviews have come in, and I think it should go through. So then we look at something that I call the PDF idea, or looking at the distribution function of meridional displacements. So we are interested in how things are mixed meridionally. So we look at how things get displaced meridionally. And so if you were to just write down a propagation equation for your PDF of a probability distribution function of your displacements in the meridional direction. So at any time, you look at all the floats and you see how much they get displaced in the y direction, and you draw a distribution function for it, and you call that P, and so it's a function of y and t. And then you just take, you get this equation. That's just the heat equation, basically, and there's a fundamental solution that exists, which is the Gaussian. And so there's a kappa over there. That's the diffusivity that we're interested in. And so once you have what the distribution function should look like analytically, you can go and start finding the moments of that thing. And so the second moment is looking at the variance. And when you write out the variance, you see that the variance of y is 2 times kappa, the diffusivity that we want to know, times t. So this is pretty good, because now we are not trying to find any DDT terms. All that you need to do is you look at your data, you look at what the distribution function looks like, you divide it by 2t, and that's it. You get your diffusivity. And that's what the black line on here is. Another thing that this thing, not assumes, but the solution looks like a Gaussian. So what you can try and do is say that, okay, well, my solution is supposed to look like a Gaussian, so what if I actually try to fit Gaussians to my data? And so we try and do a least square fits of a Gaussian to the PDFs, and that's what the blue line with the little circles are. And they seem to agree after about 300 days. And so then we go into more, details of analysis, and I'll go over it. But now the thing is that we had this data set. There were 140 floats. Some of them didn't last for 2 years. So it's a small data set. The error bars, even with the new approach, are still going to be pretty big. So now what we do is we deploy particles in a high resolution model. We take the MIT GCM, we force it at the boundaries with some global eddy resolving model, and we look at the domain of interest. We release particles at the same locations where the floats were released, but we released thousands of them. And so this is what the model particles look like. You see that they've filled the entire space. So the numbers that will come out of this would be a better representation of what's happening in this region and this region. And one thing to note is that the results right now that I'm presenting are for the Southeast Pacific. We have not started to look at what's happening in the Scotia Sea, because things get really complicated over there and these simple ideas don't apply anymore. So we said, okay, let's look at the variance of the PDF. And so there are 3 lines on here. There's the blue line, which is the DIMES floats and the float data set that I showed you. There's the green line, which are the particles that were released in the MIT GCM model. And you see that they both come to a close enough value at about 200 days, after which the floats start to diverge away from it, and the model itself starts to diverge away at about 400 days. And the reason that that's happening is that you had these particles and you had these floats that were sampling the Southeast Pacific. At some point, they start entering the Scotia Sea. They're experiencing different stirring. They are being pushed to the north, and so they're being stretched apart really quickly. And so what's happening in really long times is indication of what's happening in the Scotia Sea, but we don't worry about it. We want to know the value where the time at which these values would have asymptoted to something. There's also the red line on there, which shows the variance, but not from the mean, the variance from the initial position. So this sort of represents the stirring plus a mean flux in a certain direction. And I won't go into details of what that shows, but okay. So this is a picture that shows probability distribution functions of the float displacements at different times. The blue lines are what the DIMES floats did. The green line is for the MIT model particles. The MIT model particles are smoother because there's so many of them. So you see that as you're progressing in time, things are tending to go towards more Gaussian-like behavior. And then the red line over here is a Gaussian of kappa of 800, which is the number that we think is the diffusivity parameter, diffusivity value in this region. And okay, so it looks like about 200 days is when things start to work really well with this kappa. There's initially everything is a little bit more noisy. The data always is pretty noisy. So now the thing is that, okay, well, we are saying that 800 is doing a pretty good job, but how would things look like if you chose a kappa of 200 or some higher values? And so the blue line over here is the PDF of the MIT particles at 250 days, I think. And the green lines are what different Gaussians would look like. And just by eye, you can see that, well, 800 is doing a pretty good job. But then you can go and do some statistical tests to know that how close are these distributions to Gaussians, and we did that, and yeah, 800 seemed to do a good job in that time frame of 250 to 300 days. Okay, so that's the end of the summary of what the DIMES floats do. There were 140 tracks. We did a flow analysis, and I already talked about what happened. And for people who care about diffusivity numbers, the number is 800 meters squared per second. Okay. Now going to the Gulf of Mexico and what's happening over there. So our group is part of Deep Sea, and well, obviously we work with deep floats, and so we release deep floats in the Gulf of Mexico. These are initial tracks. I think there are 20 of them over there. All the floats were released in DeSoto Canyon, which is a canyon that's right there. This is a picture which represents where the sound sources were located to track these floats. And again, you see there's long stretches, there's things getting struck around in floats. And the questions that we were asking were similar. What controls the lateral dispersion or mixing processes in the Gulf of Mexico? And again, use observations to control and calibrate models. And those are the people who are involved. That's our group at FSU, and there's people from Woods Hole and SAIC. And, well, there are the results. I won't go into more detail about what they are, but that's sort of the end of my talk. The end. If anyone has, okay.
So let me start. So I guess I'm going to get away from the diffusivity, but what I would call the zeroth order finding in this whole thing is that as you go from the South Pacific into the Scotia, what's that called?
Scotia Sea.
Scotia Sea. Everything turns and goes to the north, and there's a very simple explanation for that, which I think the audience might appreciate if you would give it to them.
Okay. There's a simple explanation to why things are going north.
Yeah.
I don't know what the simple explanation is that you are thinking about, but
yeah, that's
I guess the general idea, at least the way that I understand it, is that, okay, let's go back. So if you look at the topography in this region, the thing that's happening is that, well, there's a lot of reasons. I guess there's blocking over there. Also, you would have a western boundary current that would form along the coast of South America. And so the way that people understand it is that the current becomes a boundary current once it goes through there. I don't know if that's the simple explanation.
The Falkland Islands continental shelf in the southern part of South America, isn't it possibly following the contours of the southern shelf at 1,000 meters?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's trying to follow topography, right, basically. Yes.
Well, you're going into shallower water. You're crossing them.
Yeah, you're going into shallow water, so you're trying to conserve PV, I guess. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
That's the simple answer.
So, yeah.
Looks like an expensive project. Who paid for this?
NSF. Yeah, it's a NSF-funded project.
And was the work down in South America done before the work in the Gulf of Mexico?
Yes. Yeah, this experiment started in 2009. The Gulf of Mexico, I think, is from BP money, which just started coming in last year, I think.
Why didn't they measure chlorinity? Was it just too difficult to do?
Salinity?
Chlorinity, which would give you salinity.
Because,
Or conductivity, I'm sorry. I meant conductivity.
oh,
Yeah.
okay. Because there's the instruments that we are deploying, they have limited power or energy on it, and so it's hard to run too many sort of measurements. Also, yeah, I think there's other problems with measuring salinity. You have to calibrate things more, and there's more instrumental drifts. But they do it with Argo floats, so you could possibly do it with these, but they just didn't. That's not how the instrument's designed.
What's the water depth of the floats in the Gulf of Mexico? Or can't you go into that?
From group discussions, I think it's about 400 or 500 meters.
Okay.
Yeah, they're not this deep. They're a little bit. They're shallower.
Well, I would guess
Yeah.
on the bottom.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I have two questions. One is that if you go back to focal length equation,
Okay. That's a hard one already.
what's your rationale to ignoring all the drift term?
What do we do to all the drift term?
Yeah.
We assume that there's no drift. So, well, the way that we so that's okay. So the red line is with the drift, and the green line is the red line is with the drift, and the blue line is without the drift. And what we want to do is we want to get rid of the drift. We don't want to know what the mean flow is doing. We just want to know what's happening around the mean flow. And so instead of looking at the variance from some initial position, which would give you the drift, we look at the variance from the center of mass. So the whole cloud's moving in a certain direction, and it's growing in size. And
Yeah, so if you wrote it as a material derivative,
yeah,
that will alleviate that problem,
yes,
right?
yeah,
So you have a cloud of particles moving, and it's expanding as it goes.
right,
And so if the left-hand side of the equation was the material derivative instead of a local derivative, then I think the question
yeah,
would be answered.
Not exactly, actually. There's two different drifts. One is by the mean flow, the other one is done by the eddy.
The what?
The eddy
Oh.
also has drift.
So the eddy drift appears because you have variations in kappa. Is that what you're talking about?
Actually, you know one term. That focal length equation should be find the derivative equals to eddy drift.
Mhm. Okay. Oh, and I think that eddy drift term does come in because when you write this equation down, so I'm not an expert on this, but at least from what I understand, is that when you assume some sort of Fickian diffusion, this equation would look like d dy of kappa d dy of p. And then once you take the derivative, it becomes dp dy dk dy plus kappa d square p dy square. And the drift term comes in if you assume that there are some variations in diffusivity. So the way to think about it is that you have a region that's being mixed really quickly, or there's more stirring happening over there, and you're starting off in the other region, which is sort of more smooth or weak. You would, by default, see that things are moving towards regions of higher diffusivity because it's entraining fluid from the side quickly. And so that's the drift. So that's what I was pointing to in this slide, that the southward displacement might not actually be the upper circumpolar deep water fluxing things to the south. It might just be these variations in eddy kinetic energy from one region to the other that show up in the floats.
So another thing that I really found interesting here is that, in essence, the mean flow is going to the north.
Mm-hmm.
So where are the return flows coming from? So if you're losing fluid to the north, how are you? What's the kinematics of the flow field
Right.
that actually sustains the the circumpolar current.
So if you go back to this, you can kind of see it in this.
Yeah.
So the way that the ACC works is that you have a few key places where you encounter shallow topography. Your PV conservation pushes things to the north. And in the rest of the domain where it's smoother topography, things are always just drifting to the southeast. So over here, things are drifting to the southeast. There's a fracture zone over here where it gets pushed north. You kind of see it in this model. I'm not sure exactly. I think it's an instantaneous field, but if you do a time average, you see that there's 3 or 4 key places where everything goes north, and then it slowly trickles back to the south. And the Drake Passage is a place where it's the southernmost point of the ACC in a way. Yes?
Have you tried looking at PV maps from the model?
Uh,
To see how that corresponds to...
No, I haven't done that yet, but that's what I want to do for my PhDs. Yes?
I wanted to ask you a question about biology.
Okay.
Did you happen to see one of the floats just all of a sudden take off and speed up and go far away and then stop working? Like maybe smaller or something?
See, the problem would be that the whale would have to spit it out for us to know. So I don't know. Well, there were 69 floats that never returned, so
But they didn't do anything erratic before they disappeared?
we wouldn't know because they never came back to send data back to us.
Oh, so they don't get to the surface, you don't see it?
Yeah, so they only come back to the surface after 2 years. And that's the thing. You release everything in 2009, you put in all this money, and then you just sit and wait for 2 years hoping that things come back. You had a question.
Yeah, so you've got those drift tracks, through the passage. And, it sort of begs the question there about whether you get some kind of Venturi effect, as you compress all that water volume into that narrow passage. And if you can actually document that with the sort of instantaneous flow rates that you might be able to get from
So Venturi effect means that you're putting the streamlines together, and so they should
Well, he
speed
also
up.
said that it's shallow at the same time, so if that's the case, then all that water volume is going to a really small amount.
Yeah, so, well, you do see that as the ACC goes through this choke point, it increases in velocity. So I guess that's kind of a Venturi effect in a way.
Yeah, it would be interesting to plot that as a velocity field.
Oh, I wonder if you can see it in this. It's hard to see, but you see that generally things get redder
Right.
as they go over there. So maybe the enhancement and the energy of the mean is because of the Venturi effect. And then once the flow becomes fast enough, there's more potential for instabilities. And that's why there's higher eddy kinetic energies. Also, there's more topography, which is affecting the eddy kinetic energy. So both the components. Yes.
Yeah, so I had a question about the measurement of the displacement based on the sonar.
Mm-hmm.
You have to assume some sort of density structure, right, in order to calculate the propagation of the sound?
Yeah, so
What kind of, did you assume that it was static? Did you assume it was variable? Did that come from a model? What kind of...
this was done before I came, but I know what they did. And I think
That's a
they
good answer.
no, so I think they looked at the hydrographic sections and they put it in some sound speed models that exist, and then they try to look at how the sound speed varies